Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. It is Tuesday, March 14th, and we are continuing in the hearing in docket number 2022-238-E. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. Present in the hearing room, we have Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carol Lee Williams, Commissioner Caston, and with us virtually, we have Commissioner Justin Williams and Commissioner Irvin. We have representatives of Dominion in the courtroom, representative of SCIBA, one in the hearing room, courtroom. I believe we have one virtual, or one virtual. We have representatives from ORS in the hearing room, and we have representatives of SACE Solar Virtual, and I'm not sure about CMC Steel. Are you with us this morning, Mr. Shishis? Okay, not here yet. Where we left yesterday, the witness for SACE CCL, Mr. Moore, is on the stand. We have concluded direct, and we are now proceeding to cross-examination. Is that correct? Someone?
Yes. Good morning, Chair Belcher. This is Kate Mixon for SACE and CCL, and yes, that's our understanding. Mr. Moore is available for cross-examination.
Thank you, Ms. Mixon. And I see Mr. Moore. Good morning, Mr. Moore.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Let's see. SCIBA, any questions for the witness?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to call CMC Steel. No response. Thank you. Office of Regulatory Staff.
No cross from ORS. Thank you, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you, Mr. Huber. Dominion.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Moore. I know we know each other, but my name is Ashley Cooper for the record. I have a few questions for you this morning.
Good morning. Always good to see you.
Thank you. Likewise. And you can see me and you can hear me just fine, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Moore, I want to begin by just asking you a couple of questions related to solar contracts. I want to start with PURPA. Are you familiar with PURPA?
I am generally familiar with PURPA, yes.
And do you understand that under PURPA, utility must take a renewable power such as solar, and in return, they should be paid an amount not to exceed the utility's avoided cost? Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
The avoided cost rate is then passed on directly to customers, correct?
Under the South Carolina system where it's recovered in the fuel charge, that's true.
Thank you. And so under South Carolina, a company like Dominion Energy South Carolina doesn't pass that cost on to shareholders, does it?
Right. The shareholders are bearing no risk on that.
Okay. You noted in your direct testimony that you testified in docket number 2020-22E concerning DESC's solar choice tariff proposal, correct?
Yes, I did.
And I have a question about that, but just real quick, you're familiar with a customer's retail rates, just generally speaking, what a retail rate is, correct?
Yes, I am.
And a retail rate takes into account the cost of generation, the cost of distribution, the cost of transmission, and perhaps some other costs, but just at a high level, is that an accurate statement?
It takes those into account and it converts them into rates that are allocated among the classes. And I think, as everybody knows, in this proceeding, it's a pretty complicated translation, but yes.
Thank you. You certainly built upon my definition, but it does represent a comprehensive set of charges that includes generation, distribution, and transmission, correct?
Yes, but it's a backward-looking
Fair enough.
assessment of those charges, yes.
And in that proceeding, the solar choice proceeding, you testified, you advocated that DESC pay rooftop solar generators a rate for the solar power they produce and export to DESC that was higher than the retail rate DESC charged its customers. Isn't that correct?
I believe that, I don't think that is accurate because you have to take into account, and I mean, this is very different from what we're talking about today, which is purchasing wholesale electricity. But in that case, you're dealing with a customer investment in solar, not a utility investment in solar. And you're dealing with a customer consuming a significant share, sometimes more than 50% of their self-invested electricity behind the meter. So the question of what the compensation for the export is very tied up in how you value the self-consumed electricity. So I think they're very different situations, and I think I'm want to be helpful with wherever your questions go, but I'm alert to the fact that it could confuse the situation.
Thank you. Well, you said in that proceeding that you said that the value of the value of energy is undervalued. You said that if somebody had their lights go out, they'd be willing to pay $100, not 12 cents a kilowatt. You said it's undervalued.
It's a different.
Just
I would object on relevance grounds here. We're talking about a completely different type of situation here, different rates applicable to an entirely different situation. I'm unclear how the tariffs for residential solar customers are relevant to this proceeding where we're talking about the competitive procurement of large-scale utility solar.
thank you, Ms. Mixon. Mr. Cooper, you want to respond?
Well, on cross-examination, I'm allowed a wide latitude to examine the witness, to probe the witness's knowledge of the subject matter, to also look at his credibility. And if I can show that in one proceeding, he's showing and arguing for higher avoided costs, and then in another proceeding related to solar, he's arguing that the company should have proceeded and pursued lower avoided costs, that goes to his credibility, and it goes to the weight the commission should put on his testimony.
I'm going to overrule the objection.
So going back, Mr. Moore, isn't it true in that solar choice docket, you said energy's undervalued?
I did say that, and that is, a slightly separate subject, but to explain that statement, I was merely making the point that the whole regulatory compact is arranged around a cost-based system. It's cost plus, right? Cost plus the utilities return on investment. And so that's the basis of the retail rates. And one effect of that system is that when there's an outage, individual customers don't have to pay a market price. Your air conditioner goes out, you go out into the market and you try to find somebody. And if it's 7 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon, you'll pay whatever price it is to get that going again. That we don't face that situation with electricity, and that's a very positive bit of our system, that even though you would pay a lot to electric, you don't have to, because we have a regulated system. My point was actually favor system we have, that in certain cases at certain times be less than the market value.
Mr. Moore, I hate to interrupt you, but you're buffering.
Can bring down the overall cost of the system.
Mr. Moore, I hate to interrupt you, but your feed is buffering. Do you have any any extra tabs open or windows open that may need to be closed?
I don't have any extra tabs open, but I'm closing programs in case.
Okay, you're still buffering. Ms. Jody, did you get that? Okay. Tell Mr. Moore, I'm asking the court reporter to tell you, we missed part of your response, and tell you where we lost you. Just a second, please.
Mr. Moore, the sentence where you said my point was actually something, that's where it started to break up. You said that having to pay, wait, let me back up one sentence. We don't have that situation with electricity, and it's a very positive, I missed a word, of our system, that even though you would pay a lot, you don't have to, because that's a regulated system. My point was, and then you began to break up.
My point was that at certain times and places, our system delivers energy much more cheaply than a free market would. But at other times, in other situations, market competition can reduce the cost of the system.
Does that complete your answer?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. And Mr. Moore, I was asking you about that you advocated for a higher avoided cost. So I'm going to read to you I think you were uncertain. So let me read you the testimony out of the transcript.
Okay, that'd be helpful.
It says, the question was, and just to recap for the commission, the retail rate is 12 cents, and CCL claims that the company's avoided costs are 14 cents, correct? And this is your answer. Yes, because as you just said, it's an avoided cost. It's not just a snapshot of a snapshot in time of today. It's what the value of turning this battleship and of avoiding. So now hearing your transcript, you'd agree with me that in that docket you were advocating the adoption of an avoided cost rate that was higher than retail rates.
I think that all we advocated for in that docket was that we either retain a one-for-one avoided cost, a one-for-one credit for retail, for residential net metering customers, or we had an expert witness, Justin Barnes, who then recommended that Dominion adopt their existing time of use rate for those customers. So we did not advocate the adoption of an increased avoided cost rate. What we advocated for was either one-for-one net metering or Dominion's own time of use rate.
Okay. And I believe it was Witness Beach that recommended the 14 cents. That may refresh your memory.
Well, Beach was including in that 14 cents to explain to the commission what was going on there.
Sure.
Is he was pointing out that there is a risk that natural gas prices will go up or down, and the ratepayers bear all of that risk, and we've seen that in the last year very strongly. And so he was pointing out that if you include that in the avoided cost, that risk, that it would be higher.
Chair Belzer,
Ms. Mix.
I'm just going to renew my objection to the extent that Mr. Cooper tends to continue to ask questions about this. It's pretty clear that these questions are not designed to try and ask questions about Mr. Moore's credibility. This is clearly for the purpose of trying to bring out like some information about the net metering dockets that is just, again, not relevant to this proceeding. It's an entirely different service and an entirely different context.
Thank you, Ms. Mixon. Your objection is noted and overruled.
So, Mr. Moore, had the commission sided with you, Mr. Beach, and adopted that high payment, that would have been passed along to customers just like a fuel charge, correct?
Under the South Carolina system, where the utilities managed to get the law so that the net metering costs also were put under the fuel charge, which is very unusual nationally, the reimbursement for exports would have been included under the fuel charge. But I don't think I ever advocated that the commission adopt an avoided cost rate of 14 cents. I think what Mr. Beach calculated was that the value to the ratepayers over time can reasonably be projected at that amount given the time of day and the change in consumption pattern net metering customers. And so what Mr. Beach and I actually advocated for is that a 1-for-1 rate would be a fair compensation given the risk of fuel cost increases, which actually did come about to pass.
Chair Bell, sir, I just read from the transcript in this prior docket, and this is from.
You can ask the commission to take notice
I
of the
just asked the
docket.
commission to take judicial notice of this testimony.
And give us the docket number again, please.
2022. Oh, sorry. 2020 229E.
Is that the generic net metering?
This was
Docket.
this was the Dominion Energy South Carolina solar choice.
Solar choice. Okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Moore, let's assume if a higher avoided cost had been adopted, that would not have been a volatile, that wouldn't have been a volatile rate, right? It would have been a fixed rate, correct?
Again, I think I've said this several times. I didn't advocate the adoption of a higher avoided cost rate.
And my, sorry, Mr. Moore, just let me clarify real quick.
Would be higher, but I did not advocate for the adoption of a higher avoided cost rate.
Okay, and so let me restate my question. Regardless of whatever you advocated for or not, I'm just asking if the commission adopted an avoided cost rate that was higher than actual avoided costs, it would be fixed for a period of time. Isn't that correct?
Well, actually, under the South Carolina system, every year, Dominion redetermines the value of solar, and it's essentially offset against the compensation to the customers and recovered in rates, so that the higher the value of solar is, the less Dominion recovers and vice versa. So it does not produce a fixed price in the way that an actual competitive procurement, which is the subject of this document, does.
Okay, thank you, and we'll get to that. So let's assume under a 15-year PPA with a fixed rate. Are you familiar with long-term PPAs that have a fixed rate, Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Okay. If that avoided cost rate in that 15-year PPA that's fixed was calculated wrong, if it had a higher cost than average cost, then for 15 years, there wouldn't be volatility, would there?
That's the great benefit, is that there's not volatility. You buy in at a fixed price. And yes, if you pick wrong and gas prices decline over the next 15 years on average, then then you end up making the wrong bet, right? And so I think the key thing to understand about that is that through a period of low gas prices, where gas prices were projected to continue to be low, and it turned out they weren't. There's a lot more upside risk than downside risk. So the solar price is known. It is, say, $34 a megawatt hour. And as long as gas prices stay so that your average doesn't rise above that, maybe you're safe. But the upside risk that it'll go to $6 or $8 is much bigger than the downside risk, because $30 gas will never go. $30 gas-fired power will never go to 10 or 0, but it could go to 80.
Okay. So, Mr. Moore, assuming, as you noted, it is possible that a 15-year fixed PPA with a fixed price could, in fact, be an overpayment. It wouldn't be volatile. It would be a straight linear line that would be constant, and it would be a constant overpayment with no volatility.
I think you're making the point very well that it is constant. So if you believe there will be no inflation for the next 15 years, and the gas price don't have a significant chance of going up, then you would stick with the gas and not hedge with renewables. But if you think it might go to 4 or 5, and you think there might be inflation, what's inflation at 2% a year, 3% a year?
Mr. Moore, we're still...
The benefit of these PPAs is locking in a steady price.
Mr. Moore, we're still missing some of your responses. Hold on just a second and let me see what we need to do.
Madam Chair, it may be helpful if I turn my camera off. I found in some of these platforms, there are too many cameras on. It could impact performance.
Well, we need commissioners to be seen so that they can certify their certification.
Understood.
Can
Madam Chair, just for your information, I've also had a little buffering coming the other way.
Okay. Just hold with us a second, Mr. Moore.
Thank you.
Yep. Mr. Moore, I was going to suggest if you might be able to try and move closer to your Wi-Fi router, or maybe that could help. I don't know. That might be an option.
I probably can.
Commissioner Williams, let's try turning your camera off, if you would. I don't like doing that, but let's try to move this along.
Okay.
Mr. Moore, I'm going to ask the court reporter to read back, if you would, your response, because there was a point where some of your response was missed. I don't know if you can fill in the blank or not, but let's see. The court reporter will read back to you a portion.
So at the beginning of your last answer, I think you were making the point very well that it's constant. So if you believe there will be no inflation for the next 15 years and the gas, and that's about where it started going in and out.
Mr. Moore, do we need to restate the question?
I think I can handle it. I think the question was if the long-term PPA price turns out to be higher than the average price of power, and I'm using the word average very loosely there, that you could make the wrong bet and you could end up on the high side of the average. And the long-term trend for the solar prices is that they keep gradually coming down. There's been a bump recently, but the trend is driven by the technology change. The gas prices are trending up, and then there's inflation. And so the fact that the price stays the same for 15 or 20 years with no inflation is a fantastic hedge. And so, yes, to Mr. Cooper's question, it is possible to be on the wrong end of that bet, but given the realities of where we are today, the company's modeling shows that you probably will win significantly.
Mr. Cooper?
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Moore, I'm now going to change topics. On page 11 of your testimony, I'll give you a second if you want to move, turn to that page. You state one benefit of a CPRE is wide accessibility to a range of potential resources. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I would say it depends on where your location is, but that's a fair, and what I mean by that is that there's a wide range of renewable contractors. There's somewhat of a range of solar technologies. There's solar and wind if you're depending on where you are geographically. So I would say it's a strength of all source procurement that you bring in all technologies. It's a strength of CPRE that you bring in multiple suppliers and potentially multiple technologies.
Well, Mr. Moore, I'm just reading your testimony. And on page 11, line 14, you say, it's not my words, you just say there are the following benefits: wider accessibility to a range of potential resources and bidders. So you said resources and bidders, not just bidders.
Yes, I stand by that.
Okay, thank you. Are you familiar with the concept of cogeneration plants?
Yes.
Do you agree with me? They're highly efficient because they trap the heat byproduct and come up with a useful secondary use of that heat byproduct?
Yes.
And cogeneration plants can use renewable fuel sources, correct?
In practice, yeah, the answer is yes, but just so people understand, particularly in the Southeast, what you're talking about is paper mills that have a lot of, there's a byproduct called black liquor from the paper process. Probably most of the megawatts of biomass cogen in the Southeast are paper mills, but there are other potential sources. It's very specific to the particular application, so it's hard to generalize about that.
Well, are you familiar that you could take methane out of a landfill and use that to power a cogen?
Yes, the methane doesn't come out as pure as gas on a pipeline, so I believe it has to be processed, and there's a lifetime for the methane that's extracted, and it's going to vary a little from landfill to landfill. So, yes.
And you recognize that there are you could use renewable natural gas and use that to power a cogen source, correct?
In theory, although the availability of actual renewable natural gas it's currently being highly subsidized by California, and not just in California. There are credits that are available elsewhere. It's a tiny, tiny percentage of the gas. So whether you're actually powering that cogen with renewable natural gas is a significant question.
So, but you're an expert on this. You're aware that there's a farm in Effingham, South Carolina, right outside of Florence. That's it's a fruit and vegetable processor that has found out that in one of their holding ponds, as a result of this, they have renewable natural gas that's capable of being put on a truck and it's capable of being put on a pipeline. Correct? That's right here in South Carolina. It's a renewable fuel source.
I know about as much about that as was contained in the press release. I don't think it's operational yet, but it's an example of a potential renewable generation, yes.
Thank you. So going back to your testimony, when you say wide accessibility to resources, you mean an all-source procurement, correct?
Actually, no. What I was thinking about is because I've seen solar procurements where the different bidders, each of them have to arrange a supply chain. And so they are going to source panels from different suppliers. They're going to source inverters from different suppliers. They have the potential to include storage. There are innovations in finance. So even if you could imagine two competing solar developers that were sourcing the exact same equipment, the same tracking racks and so forth, they will, there's a significant financial side to this, and they'll be in the position to draw on different investors and different tax advantages. And so part of the real benefit of a CPRE is that instead of going to one company's financial situation and supply chain, such as just the utility company, instead, you're looking to a whole market of companies that are each striving to innovate. And so that's what I meant by different resources. Even if you're not talking about different sources of energy, you're talking about a market instead of a monopoly.
So is there any reason then to eliminate certain resources just because they're not solar from all the benefits you just described of having this competition and bidding in and giving actual price signals?
I think that's one of the most basic questions in this docket, and so I'm glad you asked it. The benefit of an all-source procurement is that you could draw on any resource that can come to the table, but it also comes with a complexity, and it's important to understand that complexity in a procurement process has a tendency in itself to drive the price up a little bit, and so. And potentially significantly, and to potentially exclude bidders inadvertently. So as you described with the example of a solar PPA, that is a flat price and it's an all-in price. And if you were to have a competition, an all-source competition, anybody can come to the table as long as they provide an all-in price that's flat for 15 or 20 years. That would be a perfect competition in a way. But the reality is, if you open that up to all source, you won't get fossil bids because no one can financially guarantee the price of the fuel. And the price of the fuel, taking the example, for instance, of a combined cycle plant, if the combined cycle plant costs $1 billion and gas prices are low, the fuel costs about $1 billion. And if fuel is a little higher, it'll be $2 billion. So when they bid in, if they're bidding in the price of the plant, 50% or more of the total price is not in the bid, and you have to impute that in the bidding. And so in order to have an all-source competition where you're comparing apples and oranges. Some bidders are giving an all-in fixed price that'll never go up, and other bidders are giving a partial price that may be less than half the total. That's where the complexity comes in of creating an analytical construct, an evaluation construct that puts those things, mixes and matches them in a way that is fair to all the different bids. So the positive, as you described, of the all-source bid is you bring in all the technologies to compete. But the negative is that it's very complex. And I think the thing to understand about a CPRE, about a renewable only procurement, if you were to, in theory, have an all-source procurement that required an all-in price with no inflation, you would only get renewable bids. You would essentially be talking about CPRE. And I think you have to turn it around and think about it from the bidder's point of view. Putting in a bid is not a simple thing. Each of these developers has a whole team of people. They're probably working for weeks right up to the deadline. They're checking all their supply chains to make sure they can actually deliver. They're reading the bid very closely. They're trying to satisfy every aspect of it because it's a massive financial cost if they bid in and they don't deliver. If it's an all-source procurement that has numerous requirements that are not relevant to their resource, such as black start requirement in the recent Urquhart bid, from the bidder's point of view, they may or may not, there may not be any procurement of renewable energy. Meanwhile, you have other bids going around the country where there will be, absolutely will be procurement of renewable energy. So when you look at those two things from a bidder's point of view, you're going to attract a much tighter competition, an apples to apples competition with the CPRE in order to get that low cost energy resource. So there's pros and cons to both types of procurement. That's why you need them both.
Mr. Moore, President Kennedy famously said, "We choose to put a man on the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard." If you had been advising President Kennedy, we still wouldn't have reached the moon, I think. You cite in your testimony to Duke witness George Brown several times. You cite to him on page 3, you cite to him on page 11, and it's his testimony from docket number 2019-365E, which was the generic CPRE docket. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I presume since you cited to him a couple of times, you read his full testimony, correct?
I did at some point.
Okay. And I noticed that you failed to mention in citing that there was a CPRE adopted in North Carolina. You mentioned that, but you failed to mention that right before that, Mr. Brown said that the PURPA framework from 2012 to 2017 resulted in contracts that cost approximately $1 billion more than the current forecast of avoided cost over remaining term of the contracts by the time HB 589 was passed. This was due to high stale avoided cost rates available under existing policy at a time that avoided costs were steadily decreasing. You didn't happen to mention that in your testimony, though, did you?
I didn't. I think it's actually irrelevant here. I mean, I think if you tried to find a relevance, it might be your earlier point that it's possible to sign a long-term contract and get stranded high. But actually, the answer to the problem that you're describing is to have CPRE so you get an actual competitive price for solar rather than an administratively determined one, and that you optimize the procurement mechanism so that you could include something, for instance, like dispatchability. So I think that, you're describing a lesson learned in North Carolina, and one of the things that we want to do to get past that lesson learned, and indeed that's part of why they came up with CPRE there, right? It was a reaction to a historic higher PURPA price.
Okay, and all of those overpayments would have been passed on to customers, isn't that correct?
Yes, I mean, I think it would be better if the utility bore some of that risk, and we've recommended that. But under the system that that North Carolina had at the time and still has for PURPA, I believe, all the risk is on ratepayers. And we believe that the utility should have some incentive financially to manage those costs.
So the developer who said, this is my cost, that person should bear no responsibility. And when you say they should bear the responsibility for developing the project, if they've been overpaid for their product, they shouldn't bear any responsibility, though. Isn't that correct?
No, actually, I think this is a great point, that developer under a forward-looking PPA where there's been a competition and an award at a fixed price, the developer only gets paid to the degree they perform. If they don't perform like they said they would, they don't get paid. And that's the whole difference. If a utility company says that a power plant is needed and they present all the evidence and they get it approved and they build the power plant and then they operate the power plant, and it turns out it is either more expensive than was projected due to high gas prices, or the plant is not needed. Let's say it was projected to have a 70% capacity factor, but it only runs at 50. The utility still gets to fully recover the costs with the profit, despite the fact that it didn't perform the way that it was projected. That's not true with the solar PPA.
So then with a CPRE process, then what you would advocate is that when rules are adopted, then when the bidders sign a PPA, that if there are unforeseen changes in the market, such as supply chain issues, those PPAs should never be opened up or renegotiated. The developer should stand by that original quote and the original contract, and it should not be revisited. That's your testimony today?
You're mixing up two things in that question. So I absolutely do believe the developer should be held to the contract. They should be held to their promises, and they should only be compensated for performance. I think where you're getting it mixed up is if conditions change, if gas prices go up or down, the solar plant is still operating the same way they said they would, and they're still getting compensated the same way they said they would without any inflation, right? So I think you're mixing apples and oranges there.
I don't think so. I think it's pretty clear, but we'll move on. On page 9 of your testimony, you cite to a study by Ron Benz, correct?
Yes.
And you're a lawyer, correct?
Yes.
You know what the concept of hearsay is, correct?
I believe in, yes.
I mean, hearsay is the idea that you cite to somebody else's statement for the truth of the matter asserted. I know you're a very bright man and you've got a law degree. That was basic law. You know that concept, correct?
The reason I'm pausing a little is I think that the concept of hearsay is an evidentiary standard in tort law, I believe. And I think that in this, you're trying to make a parallel that is not a complete parallel, because Ron Benz did not just make a statement out of court somewhere out on the landscape that somebody heard and repeated, right? He was first qualified as an expert witness and sworn in, and his testimony was accepted as evidence. And I'm merely noting that another expert witness had a finding that was similar to Dominion's own finding, which is that adding solar energy would reduce the cost of the system.
Okay. And I appreciate that you already know where I'm going, but let me just go ahead, just for the fun of it, ask you a few questions. You understand that hearsay is excluded. It is evidentiary, and it's excluded because it's prejudicial to the opposing party because they don't get a chance to question the person who makes the statement, correct?
I believe that Dominion did have a chance to question the person who made the statement.
Not in this docket.
Right. But in the other docket, it was cross-examined.
Okay. So I can't today in this docket right now, all right, let me stop for a second here, because I think we're going to have to be very specific. He testified in a context of a fuel docket. Is that correct?
Yes, and part of his testimony was that the fuel docket and the IRP are tightly connected, and procurement is one of the ways in they're connected.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman, sir. This is Kate Mixon for SACE and CCL. Mr. Moore might be an attorney and have a legal background that certainly is relevant to his expertise in energy law and policy, but he is not his own counsel here. And so to the extent that Mr. Cooper would like to argue that portion of his testimony needs to be excluded, I would be happy to respond as counsel in this proceeding. But I don't think these questions are appropriately directed at Mr. Moore.
I haven't argued anything yet. I'm just trying to lay some foundation and ask some questions.
I don't think we're at that point yet, Ms. Mixon. I think we're still in questioning here, but we'll watch it. Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Moore, I don't have the opportunity today in this docket to question Mr. Benz about whether he accounted for supply chain issues that have been not acknowledged during this docket as driving up costs. I don't have that opportunity to ask him that question, do I?
No, but let's imagine that 10 other witnesses had found that there'd be fuel savings. I mean, could I say 10 other witnesses found there were fuel savings, and then you would say, well, I can't cross-examine them all. So it's not merely the truth of the matter of each witness, it's the interesting coincidence of the company's own modeling on solar additions in their IRP, and somebody who came in and did a backward look and proved it a different way.
No, Mr. Moore, that's not it. You provide a specific dollar figure, and you're citing that dollar figure as a truth. I also don't have the opportunity to ask Mr. Benz today when he assumed this additional solar would have been built, do I?
I mean, you could have a proxy argument with Ron Benz. I'm just noting that he gave a range of cost savings, not a specific number, and it was a reasonable range.
But I don't have the opportunity to question him about the assumptions and the underlying modeling that went in to come up with his numbers here today.
Chair Bell, sir. This is
Ms.
Kate
Mixon.
Mixon again. I hate to interject again, but again, we are getting into essentially Mr. Cooper, making legal arguments and asking those questions to Mr. Moore. Again, I would be happy to respond. Dominion would have had an opportunity to cross-examine Mr. Benz himself in that mid-year fuel proceeding, but waived that cross-examination as part of a stipulation that they reached with these parties, and the commission did have the opportunity to ask him questions. As Mr. Moore stated, like, he cited to that testimony not to verify that exact savings amount, but to show that there has been evidence filed in multiple proceedings about the benefits of solar and reducing fuel costs. And I'm not aware of any rule that states that a witness, like an expert witness, can't cite to testimony filed by witnesses in other proceedings before this commission.
Where are we going, Mr. Cooper?
I haven't made a motion yet, and so I would instruct counsel before she testifies and provides potential answers to the witness that
I think I will instruct counsel, if you don't mind.
Yes, Chair. I just would like to ask a couple more questions to establish what is a big part of his testimony. It's very prejudicial to the company, and I will, depending on what I hear from this and I lay a foundation, I will then make a motion to this before the commission that the chair can rule on.
Okay, let's get to the point.
My questions are short. It's the answers that are long, Chair. If SACE and CCL wished to put forward the Benz report, they could have simply called Mr. Benz like they did in the fuel proceeding. Isn't that correct, Mr. Moore?
I'm sure we could have chosen a different, we had the latitude to choose our witness for sure.
Okay.
I mean, I think that is part of our legal strategy you're
Yeah,
asking.
Chair Belser, these are again questions about the legal strategy. These are not questions to lay a foundation with Mr. Moore about his familiarity with Mr. Binn's testimony or anything.
Ms.
that would be
Mixon,
relevant to that.
he hasn't made a motion. He's fleshing out the testimony. Your objection is overruled at this point. I'm trying to follow what's going on, but you're overruled at the moment.
And in the context of a fuel docket, the company wouldn't have known to ask Mr. Benz at that time his thoughts about whether his study was competitive procurement or single source procurement. Isn't that correct?
I think his testimony suggested that it did actually reference this docket, that this is relevant to controlling fuel costs.
And I don't have the opportunity today to ask him if his studies would be impacted, whether it was an all source or a single source procurement. Isn't that correct?
I believe that by referencing the CPRE docket, it was clear that he included single source procurement, even though he is maybe the chief proponent of all source procurement in the country. And the way that the concept of all source procurement came before this commission at all is that CCL hired Ron Benz to come advocate for it in the Dominion merger case in 2017. So here you have the chief proponent of all source procurement also acknowledging the potential role of CPRE in managing fuel costs.
And that's my point. You just said you believe. You're not certain. I can't ask you about it, and he's not here. I can't ask him. Chair Belser, at this time, given as you just heard, the company does not have Mr. Benz here. We don't have Mr. Benz to ask important questions about the assumptions that went into his study, the relevance of his study to a CPRE docket as opposed to a fuel docket, the prejudicial effect to the company. I move that we strike those portions of Mr. Moore's testimony that refer to the Benz report and the findings of Mr. Benz study.
Can you give me page numbers and line numbers, please? And then we'll hear from Ms. Mixon.
Chair Belser, it begins with a question. Question is on line 18 of page 8. I would move that we strike from line 19 of page 8 through line 10 of page 9.
Ms. Mixon.
Yes, thank you, Chair Belser. I have a few responses. So first, I mean, this motion is not timely. Mr. Moore's direct testimony was filed on February 7th, which was 35 days ago. If Duke wanted to file a motion to strike that portion of his testimony, it could have done so at least 10 days prior to this hearing, as required by Rule 103-829. And if Duke had questions about his familiarity with the analysis, I mean, they could have served discovery on Mr. Moore, asking these questions, gotten responses back, and still had the opportunity to file a motion prior to that 10-day point. Second, I mean, Mr. Moore, Mr. Cooper talked about hearsay evidence. Mr. Moore is an expert witness in this proceeding, and expert witnesses are allowed to rely on hearsay evidence. Also, Mr. Moore, I mean, as it stated, Mr. Benz's testimony was entered into the record in the mid-year fuel proceeding. It's part of the public record. Mr. Benz himself did appear before this commission, again, at a hearing in that mid-year fuel proceeding. Dominion chose to waive cross-examination of Mr. Benz per the stipulation that was reached by all parties in that proceeding. And again, the commission had the opportunity to ask him questions about his testimony. The proposition that expert witnesses in these proceedings aren't allowed to cite to testimony filed by other witnesses in commission proceedings would I mean, Dominion itself has cited to testimony from witnesses in other proceedings that we wouldn't have the opportunity to cross-examine here. And lastly, I'd say Mr. Moore cited to that testimony again, not to verify the savings amount that Mr. Benz calculated, but again to show that there has been evidence filed in multiple proceedings about the benefits of solar in reducing fuel costs by allowing gas and coal plants to operate at a lower capacity when solar is available. And to the extent that the commission is concerned that Mr. Benz isn't here again today to defend his analysis, that just doesn't go to the admissibility of that evidence. It goes to weight, and the commission can give whatever weight to that portion of Mr. Moore's testimony that it wishes. And so I would ask that the commission deny the motion.
We're going to rule on the motion in the final order. We're going to proceed today.
Thank you, Chair. With that, I have no further questions for the witness.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Commissioners, questions for Mr. Moore? Commissioner Caston?
Good morning, Mr. Moore.
Morning.
Just two or three questions, if I may. Relative to a CPR program, I've heard, it's complex, time-consuming, costly. So will a CPR program incur cost to the utility? Will there be a cost for implementing a CPRE program?
There will be what I would consider to be really small costs for the development of the initial program, and then actually running the bid is usually covered by fees from the bidders. And I think the thing to understand here, I know a number was thrown out yesterday by Ms. Best. She estimated 300,000. I'm not trying to hold her to that number, but I think it's representative of what it costs to hire a consultant in these types of issues. Let's say this CPRE seeks to develop 200 megawatts of renewable energy. You're talking roughly about $150, $180 million. So I think the question is, would you spend $300,000 to create a process that will tend to lower the cost of a $180 million bid?
I understand. But I guess that is the big debate and big discussion it seems like we've heard the last couple of days is, does it save, does it not save? This side says it does, this side says it doesn't, but I understand what you're saying. I do. Regardless, whether it's 300,000 or whatever the cost is, ultimately the customer pays that cost. Is that a true statement?
I don't want to parse this too much. Ultimately, the customer is going to pay the cost of the power. And for instance, let's say Dominion hired a consultant for $300,000 this year, and that cost, and didn't file a rate case for 3 more years. I'm not sure that $300 cost, which is, trivial within maybe $1.7 billion a year of revenue, I'm not sure that ever for sure makes it into the rate case. Maybe they try to recover it as part of the fuel charge. It's possible. What's absolutely certain is the customers will pay the cost of fuel, and that's the big cost.
And I'm not trying to trick you or trap you there, Mr. Moore. I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate it. Is this what I've heard yesterday, and I guess somewhat this morning? It appears that the solar developers or manufacturers or whatever desire CPRE rather than QFs under PURPRA. Is that a fair assumption? Have I heard that correctly?
I really think I think the solar developers should speak to what they desire. The way I look at it, it's not really about what solar developers desire. It's about what's best for ratepayers. And in a situation where the company's own long-range plan under every scenario will acquire thousands of megawatts of solar, it's better for ratepayers to have an orderly, forward-looking process that hones the price down rather than have the company essentially be backed into acquiring solar by a series of one-off puts under PURPA. You know, PURPA's a put, right? And so a developer comes to Dominion and there's some negotiation, but basically Dominion's forced to buy the power. And there are reasons why either that situation or an all source procurement unnecessarily increases the cost of the solar energy. And so I think from a business point of view, the solar developers probably would prefer a more orderly process rather than a struggle. But I think from the ratepayer point of view, the key is optimizing the cost and the positive impact on the utility system.
Okay. What I'm trying to do personally is take all this information I've heard the last day and testimonies and such, and kind of funnel it down and I guess try to find out what the cake is. You know, what does it taste like? If that's probably an awful analogy, but it appears that those that argue that CPRE is the way to go is because there would be fixed cost versus variable fuel cost. And yesterday in questioning, and I guess yesterday I should have asked the question I just asked you. I'm always that day late, dollar short kind of thing, you know. Was that the solar panels, parts, pieces seem to be mostly manufactured in China. And maybe that's a fixed cost, maybe it's not. And also understood that, okay, fuel cost, you know, gas costs were high. Now they've come down. So, yeah, you know, they do go up and down. So all that information, well, let me ask this. Is Dominion Energy or any of the electrical companies, and this is, I don't mean this to be a loaded question, but I do mean it. Are they a benevolent organization? And by that, do they exist for non-charitable reasons or charitable reasons?
They exist for two reasons. They exist to serve the public, and those that are IOUs also exist to make a profit, and there's nothing wrong with that. I believe it's the role of the commission to make sure that the role of serving the public is fulfilled without, you know, excess reward to the shareholders. In other words, a fair return, but not an excessive return. The thing that we're discussing today is not directly the return, it's one of the expenses. And the way our regulation is structured today, the utility bears no risk on the fuel, and the fuel is probably the most risky part of the whole business. So that risk falls on ratepayers. So I think there's two concepts that keep coming up in every witness's cross-examination or questioning by the commission. Sometimes we're talking about cost and sometimes we're talking about risk. And the two are obviously related, because when we talk about risk, there are many different types of risk, but in this context, we're talking about the risk of an unexpected significant cost increase. So you were asking, is it a benevolent organization? I think it is benevolent in that it serves the public, and I don't think there's anything unbenevolent about making a profit. I think that can be benevolent too, but I think it's legitimate to look into the largest expense and try to keep it from being unexpectedly high.
Well, thinking back, that probably wasn't a fair question to even ask you. And I agree. I guess the hope or desire is, at least from my perspective as a commissioner, is exists for a profit. It's the degree of profit that matters. Customers shouldn't have to pay 1 penny more than necessary. Does that seem reasonable?
Well, I think that is reasonable, but I was saying something a little different, because what we're dealing with today is something that, at least in the short term, doesn't affect the profit one way or the other. It does eventually affect the profit, but really we're talking about a major pass-through expense. And so Dominion can be profitable if that pass-through expense is high, and it can be profitable if it's low. We're trying to have a situation where that pass-through expense is lower.
Okay. I guess as I think about this back and forth, and I'm, not trying to highlight or pick on any one entity. Matter of fact, not trying to pick on anyone. But when I think of the broader picture, the big picture, me trying to better understand this, where we are, what's being asked of us, is whether it be the solar installers, manufacturers, suppliers, they exist to make a profit also. Is that
Yes,
true?
they definitely do.
And again, I guess I should have asked this question of Mr. Levitas and Davis yesterday. Is CPRE something that they prefer over PERPA QF? And if so, why? I'm assuming they're no more benevolent than the electric utility, and that may be a false assumption. But if they desire this more, not saying that that's bad, is it safe to assume that they're desiring it because it's to their benefit more? Or is that a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement. And again, just as with the utility, I don't think it's bad for the utility to make a profit. I don't think it's bad for the solar developers to make a profit. I think where we need to, if I may, where we need to focus is what's best for the ratepayers.
I think that's a good point. And Mr. Moore, I appreciate it. You've been very gracious, and I hope my questions weren't too confusing, but thank you for answering. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carolee Williams?
Thank you. Mr. Moore, good to see you. You're streaming far better. I don't know what changed, but all the changes that were made produced a better result.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with a basic item from your testimony, and it's at the bottom of page 3 and the top of page 4. And it's, you don't have to go to it, but create a procurement process that uses longer contract tenor to reduce prices and steer solar developers towards CPRE rather than one-off PURPA projects should be taken into account. I think what I want to ask about is the contract tenor. And are you really referring to the competition that results as a result of CPRE?
Here's what I was referring to there. Act 62, the key compromise that allowed it to pass was a reduction in the length of the contracts for PURPA contracts. And so
remind me what that length is. Are we looking at 10 years?
So, and I'm struggling a little because I can't remember the exact statutory language. I remember the deal, and the deal was that the floor under those PURPA contracts came down to 10 years. Okay. Not for all sizes of projects, but for setting the avoided cost to underlie the contracts. Essentially, we went from 15-year contracts to 10-year contracts. And the solar developer, no one's going to enter a contract if they can't get back the money at least the money they invested, right? So the shorter you make the contract term, the more you have to recover in each year up to a point. And if you lengthen the contract term, you can offer a smaller price up to a point. And my point in that testimony is that designing a CPRE program as an alternative to PURPA would enable the parties and the commission to optimize that contract tenor to get the lowest price. So there's a number of different kind of knobs you can turn to try to get the price up or down. And that's a key one. And because the statute essentially steers us towards 10-year terms for PURPA, what I'm saying is CPRE lets you revisit that question and potentially get a lower price.
Thank you. The commission in this docket had 8 questions and regarding how CPRE would be managed. I did not see you answer all 8 of those questions in your testimony, but that's just background. My question is, should those that we are not confident about, should those be relocated to a stakeholder process?
I think that if the commission is uncertain about how to rule on something, that that would be a reasonable path. I think, I mean, just to be clear, these stakeholder processes are resource intensive for interveners and time consuming. And but I've also been in the position of being an advisor to the commission, the Arkansas Commission, and I know how beneficial it is for the parties to be given a chance to work things out and bring a solution to the commission rather than trying to hash it out through litigation, which I believe is nobody's favorite outcome. And so I think the stakeholder processes can be very productive if the commission defines what they want to come out at the end and gives a deadline. I mean, it's simple management, right? If the stakeholder process is open-ended, it doesn't have an end, and we don't know what we're talking, what the commission wants, it's less productive.
Okay. Are you generally familiar with witness Morgan's testimony?
Yes.
In it on page 9, he lists 6 items that should be functions of the independent administrator. Do you have any insights on that based on your experience with CPRE?
So I don't remember each of the 6, but my read of witness Morgan's testimony is that instead of going into detail on CPRE, he recommends all source procurement as an alternative that he believes is better. And the functions of an independent administrator are more complex. There's more for them to do if it's an all source procurement than if it's a CPRE. Just another qualitative, kind of trigger, it's more complex if the utility is bidding in to its own process than if it's not. So I would say the simplest situation is you have a CPRE and the utility's not bidding in, then the independent administrator really just needs to administer a fairly straightforward bid. And it gets more complex as you either add technologies or add the utility in.
Thank you. Several places in your testimony you reference witness Levitas and witness Cersei's testimony from the generic docket. And you recommend that we go and look at that. And I haven't done that yet. So I wanted to give you a chance to expound on what you wanted us to find when we go to look at that. And did that get covered in witness Levitas's testimony yesterday?
I think the Levitas side of that got covered by Mr. Levitas. I think what, and I'm going off memory here though, what witness Cersei recommended was essentially to get started using a simpler process and then refine it as you go on. And to some degree, we began to do that, as witness Best said, by developing an all-source procurement it's not prepared in a way to address every situation that's going to come up in the future, but it addressed the situation at our card. And so similarly, I think starting with the CPRE that, for instance, is limited to the type of solar acquisitions identified in the company's 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023 IRPs. I mean, over and over, the modeling says that's what we're going to need. I think the gravamen of witness Cersei's testimony would be to begin with something simple like that and do a procurement and then recalibrate if needed. I believe he also talked about having independent administration if the utility bids in. So I think that was another just very basic recommendation. And I believe his testimony also focused on the ability to reduce fuel cost risk.
Thank you. I appreciate your answers and appreciate your being here today. No further questions.
Vice Chair Powers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And good morning. When I was talking to Ms. Best, did you hear her testimony yesterday?
Yes, sir.
One of the things I was trying to get clear of, there was a lot of talk about public interest. And I was wondering, comparing that or differentiating the public interest from the interest of the ratepayers and to the shareholders of Dominion stock. Can you make the difference as to who this program benefits?
I think it's a great question, and anytime you talk about the public interest, it's a broad term on purpose, and so it's broad as well as subtle. So the ratepayer's interest is to have reliable service at the least reasonable cost. So I didn't say the least cost. I mean, they're reasonable expenses and investments that ensure reliability, that ensure that the service is not, for instance, vulnerable to major storms in a way that causes major service interruptions. So the ratepayer's interest is to have safe, reliable, affordable service. The shareholder's interest is to earn on their investment. And the public interest, I believe, is broader, and it allows the commission to take into account things that are important but are not narrowly captured by the interest of the ratepayers of a specific utility. So, for instance, sometimes an action that a utility might take in the interest of its own ratepayers will affect the ratepayers of a neighboring utility one way or the other. That's part of the public interest, even though it might not come into that individual case. The public is made up also of more than ratepayers, right? And so you have families, the parents pay the bill, the kids aren't ratepayers, but their interests are involved. You have future ratepayers. They aren't ratepayers yet, but if you build $1 billion plant, you're deciding that those people in the future who aren't even ratepayers yet are going to pay more on their bill, or maybe less if it's a smart investment. So I think the public interest, and the public has an interest in cleaner air and water, right? And so the public interest is broader than the interest of today's ratepayers in one utility. And so I think CPRE serves the ratepayers' interests and the public interests, and I don't think it harms the shareholders' interests. I mean, there is an argument that the utility company doesn't want to take on PPAs because in the future they may want to build a power plant, and this reduces the need for the power plant, and so it avoids an investment, and so they're putting less in rate base. I think that's a little bit of a short-sighted view. I think that there may be some of that motivation, but in the long run, I think most utility executives understand that they need to align with how technology changes and what the new opportunities are, and being able to operate in an environment where there are lots of evolving technologies available that will enable us to do a better job of providing safe and reliable and affordable utility service. That's a better long-term bet for the shareholders than trying to keep doing things the same old way, even though times change.
Another thing Miss Beth said was that she felt like with the existing framework that Dominion had, they could have a CPRE program up and running within 2 to 3 months. What would be your opinion of that?
Well, I don't think she committed to have a CPRE program. She committed that they would have one if a number of conditions were met, and those conditions, I think Dominion would like to remain under the control of Dominion. So I think, first of all, even if it could be done in 2 to 3 months, it's starting when, and it could be years from now. But second of all, I think that the idea that CPRE could be ready to go in 2 to 3 months, it obviously assumes that the commission doesn't review it very long, or maybe doesn't review it at all, because it's almost impossible to have a proceeding from start to finish that doesn't take 2 to 3 months. So I think the time schedule for resolving issues that Mr. Levitas suggested yesterday, 6 months. That's enough time to have several meetings and to go between the meetings, go back and think about what the other party said and come up with solutions. I think that's a more realistic development timeline. And then we have to work out, if we go down that route, what will be the commission essentially needs to bless it. I think on its face, that takes more than 2 to 3 months.
Okay. Do you have any opinion as to what the initial cost would be, or if it'd be necessary to have someone overseeing the program, an outside person at this point, or could the program just be put in the queue, as you might say, and ready to roll when needed?
I definitely think it should be put in the queue to be ready to roll. And the reason for that, I think, is important to understand. Time is the real enemy and barrier to the development of any of these utility facilities, whether it's a transmission project or a power plant or a solar development. And the longer the timeline is, the more risk of things going wrong. And the limit on ratepayer benefits is how fast and how quickly can we actually bring lower cost resources online. And so what that comes down to is, if you miss a year, you've lost 150 to 300 megawatts. And there's a very real risk that if we don't get started now, we'll miss a year. I think I'm losing a little bit I think half of your question.
That helps. The other thing, when I say cost, do you have a number in mind as to?
I think the cost is, I think that Ms. Best had a pretty good estimate, somewhere in that range to facilitate the development, with multiple parties, of a robust CPRE offering. And I would say I'd be open to independent administration of that process. I think we had assumed that it would be under the auspices of Dominion, but hiring someone with as much independence as possible.
Mr. Moore, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Moore. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I have basically just follow-up question to one of Commissioner Powers' questions. I think I heard you say something to the effect that a decision or an action by a utility can have an impact on a nearby utility, and just trying to follow what maybe you were talking about when you said that.
All of the utilities are physically connected through their transmission systems. So, for instance, when Santee Cooper retires the Winya plant in Georgetown, that's not on the Dominion system, but it'll change the way electricity flows on the Dominion system. And Dominion has to take that into account. Another example, and I've seen this in a specific case, if one utility has an energy efficiency program that reduces peak load, that reduces peak load across more than just their part of the grid. It slightly changes the price of natural gas. It's possible, and I've seen this, to have gas and electric utilities work together on energy efficiency programs, so they lower the administrative cost for each and get joint benefits. When you think about the winter morning, what's happening on the gas pipelines on the winter morning? they're trying to deliver gas to electric power generators. They're also trying to deliver gas to people at home using a furnace. So you've got a coincidence of usage there that they affect each other. Like one reason that an electric industrial customer might be interrupted is because there's a high demand for gas for residential gas customers. So, you know, each case that comes before you, you have this almost tunnel vision on the facts that are relevant to that case, but they all interact a little bit is my belief.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. That's all I have.
Commissioners, further questions? Mr. Moore, good morning. I have just a question. You were asked about your testimony on page 11. Let me let you get there.
When I changed to get closer to the router, I didn't bring that testimony with me.
Okay.
I can run get it.
No, that's okay. You were asked, and it was page 11, line 14. You were questioned about, there was some bullet points there, and one of them was wider accessibility to a range of potential resources and bidders. Do you remember that
Yes.
discussion? Well, as I read your testimony, the question was, can you briefly summarize the record evidence supporting a public interest finding for development of CPRE? And your answer is yes. There are the following benefits outlined by witness best. And then there are these bullet points. So are those your benefits that you're stating, or are those the benefits stated by witness best?
So those benefits, that bullet list, if I remember, is towards the end of my direct testimony.
It is on page 11 or 14.
Yes, and it refers back to a point that I made earlier. So the point that I made earlier was that Ms. Best described benefits, positive outcomes from the recent stakeholder collaboration to develop the Urquhart procurement mechanism.
And I believe you discussed that beginning on page 4 of your testimony. Does that start?
Yes. So that's footnoted on at that point back to Ms. Best's testimony. And my point was that the idea of getting stakeholders and the company together, the company is a stakeholder, to collaboratively develop a competitive procurement process, it produces benefits that she describes. And so doing it again will also tend to, it has at least the great potential to similarly produce those benefits. And so attracting multiple resource developers to compete to develop resources rather than relying on a single source procurement, that's one of those benefits that she acknowledges, and I'm summarizing there.
Okay. And have you participated in stakeholder engagements for development of CPRE programs?
The short answer is no on that, but I did participate in the one that we just talked about, which was an all-source procurement.
The Urquhart one.
Yes, I've had other experience with CPRE, but not the development of the mechanism.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate your responses to my questions. Commissioners, anything further? Ms. Mixon, any redirect?
Yes, Chair Belzer, I do have a few questions on
Well,
redirect.
let me ask you this. Would you mind if we take a short break before you begin?
No, that's fine with me.
We've been going about an hour and 35 minutes, so let's break until, let me look at the clock here, 11:20.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Huber.
Can I raise just one thing real quick before we go to break? I want to raise just for the commission to consider. I don't want to speak for the parties, but I know we have one witness, Mr. Morgan, filed direct testimony. I don't want to speak for the parties, but I don't believe any have cross for Mr. Morgan. Subject to that, the parties not having crossed, I was going to offer to stipulate Mr. Morgan's testimony subject to any questions the commission might have of him.
His summary won't take that long, Mr. Huber. Let's hear from Mr. Morgan,
Thank you, Madam Chair.
if you don't mind. Thank you. We're going to take a recess until 11:20. Thank you. Welcome back to the Public Service Commission in the continuation of the hearing in docket number 2022-238-E. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin and Commissioner Justin Williams. Present in the hearing room, we have Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carol Lee Williams, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. Mr. Moore is still on the stand, and we recognize Ms. Mixon for redirect.
Thank you, Chair Belser. Mr. Moore, I just have a few questions for you. First, do the net metering rates for rooftop solar customers have any bearing on the costs from a utilities procurement of utility scale solar, such as through a CPRE program?
There may be some attenuated relationship, but the basic answer is no. If you issue an RFP today for future contracts to provide renewable energy, the prices are going to be based on that bidding structure and not on some other issue like the past rooftop solar.
And you also had some questions from Mr. Cooper about PURPA and avoided costs. Are competitively procured solar projects paid avoided cost rates set through an avoided cost proceeding under PURPA?
No, in fact, one of the reasons that North Carolina developed its CPRE program was to attempt to get below those costs.
Thank you. Commissioner Caston and Commissioner Powers both asked some questions about the costs of a CPRE program and impact to ratepayers. And some of those questions were about the administrative costs of developing and implementing a program, such as from hiring an independent administrator. Is there a way to structure or design a CPRE program so that those costs are covered by the bidder?
In general, implementation is covered by bidder fees.
And so does that mean those costs are not borne by ratepayers?
Only in an indirect way. In other words, bidders have to price in everything they do into their bids. But there's no obligation to recover those costs from ratepayers. And for instance, if a solar developer only performed 50%, let's say they provided 50% of the energy they said they would, you're only paying for that 50%. You're not paying for the other 50%. So even if the bidding costs were priced in, you wouldn't pay them.
Thank you. And there were also some questions about fixed versus variable costs of solar. Is it your understanding that solar panels from a developer, like those are typically bought before or at the time of construction of one of those projects?
Yes, I think what we're dealing with is a general use of the term variable versus the way that it's used in public utility regulation. So when I look at a utility and I talk about their variable cost, I'm talking about the cost of fuel and personnel as opposed to the cost of capital. And I think what the questioner was saying is that the cost of supplies to develop a renewable energy project can vary. Those are actually, a lot of them are capital costs, and it's true from week to week. Costs in the market go up and down. But the great benefit of the CPRE is that that thing will be built at the promised price and will deliver at a flat price with no inflation for 15 years or 20 years.
So in other words, once a project is built or is contracted for, the costs of the solar panels, that they won't change over time. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And what about the power itself? So what Dominion here would pay for the kilowatt hours, megawatt hours of energy produced? Will those costs change over the life of the project?
No, usually in these bidding processes, a developer is required to give an all-in flat price over the term, but they are allowed also to suggest other pricing structures. So it's possible to get a bid that starts at a lower cost and has a, say, a 2% escalator as an alternative to the flat price. But the flat price, it's always available, and B, it enables the comparison of different bids in a way that you can't replicate for other types of resources.
And so are the costs known at the time that the contract is signed?
Yes, the cost of the power is it's an all-in flat price for years. So you know it on the front end. That's the nature of the hedge.
Thank you. And you stated in response to another question from Commissioner Caston that customers would pay the cost of the solar power that would be produced through solar procured through CPRE. And so I want to talk about that a little bit more. Do gas and coal plants operate like an on-off switch where they're either going at full capacity or not at all?
No, I'm sure the commissioners are familiar that the power plants have to be operated so that they follow load. And the nuclear plant, you're not really turning it up and down. So when the load goes up and down, what you're doing is turning the gas and coal plants up and down, and primarily the gas plants. So if there's more solar added to the system, it means that the plants that consume fuel run less.
And so can you explain how solar power can offset the fuel costs from those plants in a little bit more detail?
Yes, so there's a cost to the solar, which is known on the front end when you sign the contract. I think we could probably fairly call it something like $31 a megawatt hour or $34 a megawatt hour. It depends on the tenor of the contract. It depends on a lot of variables, but that's a ballpark figure that I'm taking from recent avoided cost dockets. And again, the purpose of CPRE is partly to try to get an even better price. Santee Cooper got a better price when they did CPRE. But it's a fixed known price anywhere in a range from really $25 to $38. In a best case scenario, at a low gas price, the combined cycle plant is going to be in the neighborhood of $28 a megawatt hour, but more recently it ran much more than that. And the coal plants are going to be running at maybe $40 a megawatt hour. The peaking power plants could be over $100 a megawatt hour. So when solar comes on at a known fixed price of maybe 31 or 34, it's offsetting some other power plant that for which the fuel is often exceeding the all-in cost of the solar. And you have fuel and you have other variable costs. And so just on an energy basis, you're trading in a cheaper megawatt hour for a more expensive megawatt hour. And that's the cost savings that Dominion's own modeling is showing and that we are trying to get on behalf of the ratepayers.
Right. And so when there are those savings from solar compared with that, when gas or coal is, most expensive and solar can replace that, when do ratepayers get to benefit from those savings?
The savings are reflected in the fuel cost rider. And so within a year, they will improve that fuel cost rider.
Okay. And does Dominion's own filed IRP suggest that solar can be used in that way to lower Dominion's fuel costs?
Yes, the modeling includes very little capacity value for the solar, so it's primarily, almost exclusively valuing it on its energy benefits. And that's the type of benefit that I just described, that it's likely that the solar megawatt hour is cheaper than whatever other megawatt hour in the system would otherwise have to run at that time. And, you know, it would be one thing if it was just 1 year of projected, but when you see it year after year after year after year at $300 a megawatt hour hitting the cap, that's not telling you you need to add 300 megawatt hours at 300 megawatts each year. That's telling you that you could add significantly more, but for the interconnection constraint that was hard coded into the model. So there's a strong evidence that there are cost savings available. And the only question really is how do you realize them in the most efficient manner?
And so, are you saying that ratepayers would see the savings from these programs in the fuel docket year after year over the course of the contract?
Yes, and I'm also saying that it would show up almost immediately after the solar plants come online. And if you tarry in the development of the acquisition, you're losing precious years.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Those are all of my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Mixon. I'm gonna go by the parties. Sasiba,
No questions.
ORS,
No questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dominion,
No questions, Chair.
commissioners on the recross. There are no further questions for you, Mr. Moore. Thank you for your testimony, and you may stand down.
Thank you.
Ms. Mixon, anything else from SACE CCL?
No, Chair Belzer, nothing else.
Thank you. Mr. Huber for the Office of Regulatory Staff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. ORS calls O'Neill Morgan to the stand.
Mr. Morgan?
Mr. Morgan, if you would raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly affirm the testimony?
Right hand.
Sorry, right hand. Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you.
You might be left-handed. Well, everybody just goes to their dominant hand, so. Mr. Huber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Morgan, would you please state your full name and occupation?
My name is O'Neill Morgan. I'm employed by the state as a senior engineer at the ORS.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. And are you the same O'Neill O. Morgan who pre-filed 10 pages of pre-filed direct testimony in this case on February 7th, 2023?
Yes, I am.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony?
No, I do not.
Now, if I asked you the same questions today as those posed in your pre-filed direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Madam Chair, ORS asks that the pre-filed direct testimony of O'Neill Morgan be entered into the record of the case as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Morgan's direct pre-filed testimony will be entered into the record as if given from the stand.
Mr. Morgan, did you prepare a summary of your direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
Would you please present your summary to the commission?
Yes, thank you. Okay, it's morning. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the commission. The purpose of my direct testimony is to present ORS's findings and recommendations regarding ORS's review and examination of Dominion Energy South Carolina Incorporated's initial pleading of its competitive procurement of renewable energy CPRE program and compliance with certain sections of the South Carolina Energy Freedom Act, also known as Act 62. The company's filing included a detailed discussion of the items the Commission required the company to address in Order Number 2022-482. It is ORS's position that the development and implementation of a CPRE program should be driven by specific system needs identified in a Utilities Commission-approved IRP. This will set the foundation for a cost-effective procurement program designed to meet the specific needs of the utility and its customers. The company should evaluate the most recent IRP approved or accepted by the Commission before proposing a procurement program. In addition, when resource needs are identified, ORS generally recommends a competitive all-source procurement process be utilized and the company utilize an independent third party to develop and manage the implementation of the process. This would ensure a high level of transparency throughout the procurement process and ultimately benefit South Carolina customers and interested stakeholders. This concludes the summary of my direct testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Madam Chair, Mr. Morgan is now available for questions from the parties and the Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Huber. Sasiba, any questions?
No questions, but thank you.
CMC Steel? No response. CCL, any questions?
Yes, Chair Belcher, we just have a couple of brief questions.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Morgan. It's good to see you again. Your testimony recommends all source procurement rather than renewable specific procurement. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you're familiar with Act 62?
Yes,
right?
I am.
And so you would agree, would you not, that the legislature directed the Commission to specifically look at whether competitive procurement of renewable energy within a given utility's balance area is in the public interest?
Yes, I would.
And the Commission ultimately makes that determination of what, or whether it is in the public interest, right?
Yes.
Now, your testimony, it doesn't provide any evaluation or analysis of the potential benefits of renewable specific procurement for Dominion's system, does it?
No, it does not.
And so, for instance, your testimony doesn't provide any analysis or discussion of potential fuel savings from additional low-cost renewables on Dominion system. Is that right?
No, it does not.
And your testimony doesn't analyze the costs and benefits of a competitive procurement of renewable energy compared with an all-source procurement, does it?
No, it does not.
Okay, so in other words, you would agree that your testimony doesn't provide any evaluation of Dominion's system and whether a competitive procurement of renewable energy for Dominion would save its customers money.
Objection. That's a mischaracterization of Mr. Morgan's previous responses.
Rephrase the question, please, Ms. Mixon.
Okay. I'm not sure that it is a misstatement, but Mr. Morgan, so your testimony does not provide any evaluation of Dominion's system and whether a competitive procurement of renewable energy would save Dominion's customers any money. Is that right?
That is right.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Those are all of my questions.
Thank you,
Thank
Ms.
you.
Thank you, Ms. Mixon. Dominion?
Just two brief questions, Chair. Mr. Morgan, good morning. My name's Ashley Cooper. I'm here on behalf of.
Is that microphone on, Mr. Cooper?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Mr. Morgan, good morning. My name's Ashley Cooper. I'm here on behalf of Dominion Energy, South Carolina.
Good morning, sir.
Your testimony responds to the 8 questions that were provided for all parties to address in this docket. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
And so one of the questions was simply asking to address whether or not a CPRE program should be conducted in a technology neutral manner to the extent possible so that utilities, renewable energy resources are procured by competitive solicitation process open to all technologies or independent market participants. It didn't ask for studies. It just asked you to address that high level question, correct?
That is true.
It also asked, question 7 was whether or not the utility should conduct an open, non-discriminatory CPRE process that fairly considers both third-party utility ownership, resource types, combination of resource types, sizes, capacities.
That is true.
Thank you very much. Nothing further.
Thank you,
sir.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Commissioners, questions for Mr. Morgan? Commissioner Caston?
Good morning, Mr. Morgan.
Morning, sir.
On, let's see, page 6, lines 6 through 7 of your direct, relative to the question if CPRE should originate and be driven by the IRP, you basically state, well, I guess I could get it. Failure to evaluate the system needs first may result in the development of a procurement program that adds unnecessary cost burdens and delivers few, if any, benefits to the customers. So, again, don't let me put words in your mouth. Is this saying, basically, before the utility proposes a procurement program, system needs should be evaluated first?
That's correct.
Page 8 of 10. And I guess lines 3 through 4, possibly more. ORS recommends a competitive all-source technology-neutral RFP over a single-source technology program. Again, don't let me put words in your mouth. That sounds pretty much like what witness Best said. Is that a true statement?
Yes, it is. That's our preference.
And maybe this was asked or kind of been asked, but I'm just kind of cut to the chase and ask it.
Okay.
You can answer it. Does ORS believe a requirement for the utility to have or implement a CPRE program is in the public interest?
It's very difficult to answer that question. Why? The company did not propose a program for us to do a in-depth evaluation of that program to make a determination if the cost of that program would be reasonable or prudent and in the public's interest.
Okay, but I guess, again, I'm not trying to paint you in a corner, but seeing your testimony, recalling what Ms. Best testified to, that if it is ORS's view, which seems to concur with Dominion's, that all source technology neutral RFP over single source technology program is the more, you don't use the term prudent, but if that is ORS's recommendation, again, not trying to put words in your mouth, but if that's the recommendation, and which is what I think Ms. Best said, then why have a CPRE program? I mean, if all source technology neutral is recommended, then is it wrong for me as a commissioner to assume that that is in the best interest or the public interest?
Well, ORS understands that the all source technology neutral RFP program allows the opportunity for all viable resources to compete on a level playing field. Now, if after that evaluation, renewable energy comes out to be the best viable option at that time, that would be selected, and the commission, the stakeholders, and the public would have some amount of comfort level that all sources were looked at to make the best possible decision for the company and its customers. There are instances also where the company may have a situation where they think at this time a single source RFP procurement program is best for this technology at this time. We're just saying when those situations occur, inform the commission and we'll look at that, but overall, an all source procurement program should be best. And if the interveners would see that truly what they have been saying, renewable energy is the right source to alleviate or to meet the company's needs, then that will show up and everyone would be comfortable that truly rigorous, robust process was carried out, and indeed renewable energy was the best option.
I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to read the transcript to totally follow all that, but I think I followed what you said.
Okay.
Okay, so from the intervener's side, saying, okay, it's not just capacity, it's energy, it can be savings through variable fuel cost, and it may be from the utility side, which I've heard so many different things. And I think what I'm seeing or hearing in your testimony is still the all source technology neutral, or I think it's best called the agnostic technology or the agnostic view, is evaluate what the need of the utility will be to meet whatever demands, whether it's capacity, energy needs. Will that need to be dispatchable, non-dispatchable? does all of that make sense that I just said? That, am I understanding what you're saying is that the utility, based on the IRP, should evaluate all of that stuff to determine which is the best route to go independent of the technology?
That is what we're saying.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. I don't think I have any more questions. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Commissioner Carolee Williams?
Thank you. Good to see you, Mr. Morgan.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yesterday we heard testimony that the IRP was the place for determining what the source should be, and the question of whether the question about all source or specific technology would emerge out of the IRP. Do you agree with that? And if so, or if not, please amplify.
Well, I agree with that. That's where you will see the need, but I don't want to go too in depth because the IRP that we're looking at now is still an open docket before the commission. But
and I only meant generically. I didn't mean the 2023 IRP specifically, but just generically. Generally,
that's where you will see the potential needs for the company system we called out in the IRP.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. That was it. Thank you.
Commissioners, further questions?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Irvin?
Thank you. Dr. Morgan, did you use or reference or read the Dominion 2022 IRP to help you reach your decision or your opinion?
Yes, I did review the IRP, and my review is continuing, I should say.
Were there recommendations in the 2022 IRP that included renewable sources of energy like solar?
Yes, there was.
Do you recall how much solar is needed by Dominion in the 2022 IRP?
No, I do not recall the size, magnitude, no.
But is it fair to say it was going to be needed for several years, beginning in 2026, 2027, around that range, at your recollection?
Yes.
And going on after that each year. Is that true?
That is true.
Are you familiar with Act 62?
Yes, I am.
Do the words agnostic or open source, technology neutral, do those terms appear in Act 62?
Yes, I believe so.
Well, isn't it true that the General Assembly required us to consider renewable energy sources in Act 62 when considering CPRE program?
Can you rephrase the question?
Yes. My understanding of Act 62 is that the General Assembly chose to use the phrase renewable energy sources in relation to developing a CPRE program for South Carolina. Is that your understanding?
My understanding is the General Assembly directed the commission to investigate if a CPRE program would be in the public's interest.
That's right. And it went on to say that renewable sources should be considered, right?
Yes, CPRE, competitive procurement of renewable energy.
That's right. Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Irvin. Commissioners, further questions? Mr. Huber, any redirect?
No redirect, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Morgan, thank you for your testimony today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hope you have a good day. You may stand down.
Okay, you too.
Anything else from ORS?
No, Madam Chair, that concludes our presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Huber. Dominion, anything else from Dominion?
No, Chair Belzer. Nothing further from Dominion.
Oh, we got some online. Yeah. Council, I'm going to ask that y'all talk with Mr. Stark about dates for proposed orders, availability of transcript, and then dates for proposed orders after transcript's available. And so with that, I'm going to ask Ms. Mixon, is she our only counsel online? Please stay on the line online so that you can participate in that discussion if you would. And with that, is there anything further from? I'm sorry, who did I leave out?
I was just telling you I was happy to stay online, Madam Chair. This is John Burns. Sorry.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Burns. I was looking at Mr. Witt in the room, so I knew that Sasiba was represented, but please stay on the line as well. I apologize for omitting you. Anything else from any party? Thank y'all very much. Thank you to your witnesses, and thank you to council. We appreciate your presentations in this hearing. And with that, we will adjourn the hearing, and if y'all will coordinate with Mr. Stark, and then I'm sure he'll send out an email that will be posted to the DMS as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day and safe travels to those of you that are traveling somewhere. Thank you.